All right, I guess I'll start. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Christina Mora, and I, along with Eric Schickler, direct the Institute of Governmental Studies. It's a pleasure to see such a full house here today. I'll just give a brief and short introduction to the panel and to Scott. As the nation's most populous and diverse state, California often leads the way in democratic innovation, but it also faces significant threats from voter suppression and misinformation to rising political polarization and distrust of institutions. Today, as the National Guard continues its work in LA, as roving bands of federal agents pick up residents across the state, and as the state ponders a new redistricting plan, questions about the future of California democracy seem more pressing than ever. And today we are so fortunate to bring together a panel of experts and policymakers as well as new inside look on our IGS polling data as we come together to discuss many of these issues and think about what's the path ahead and what can be done. And we are grateful to our very own Scott Schaefer for helping us moderate this session and get us started. If you don't know already, he's a host of the hit podcast Political Breakdown and a senior editor of KQED. And he told me he does not like long introductions. So thank you very much. Come on up,
It's
Scott.
like the Emmy Awards, you know. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for braving the heat. Well, there's the old expression, may you live in interesting times, which is not, by the way, an ancient Chinese curse. A lot of people say it is. That's not the case. We are living in extraordinary times. We're living through, I guess, through history, which you could say is always true, but we don't know how history is going to analyze these times, but they certainly are extraordinary. We've got a governor who is calling the president of the United States a menace to California. He is threatening federal funding to UCLA and UC Berkeley and all kinds of programs up and down the state. And the president, who really doesn't want to relinquish control of the House of Representatives, pressured Texas to pass a redistricting plan, which they did, to make those House districts more favorable to Republicans. Gavin Newsom said we got to fight fire with fire. And so on the November 4th ballot, voters are going to decide on Proposition 50. Which would temporarily rip up the map drawn by the Non-partisan Citizens Commission, which voters approved more than a decade ago, temporarily because they're saying the commission will go back to work in 2030 after that census. We'll see how voters like that. The stakes, of course, are enormous, not just for Prop 50, but for all of the elections happening across the country. Control of the House is really critical. And today we're going to take a look at all these issues, Prop 50, voting rights, access to ballots, and everything else related to elections. I'll tell you who's here. Eric Schickler, right in front of me here, is the professor of political science and co-director of the Institute for Governmental Studies here at Berkeley. Angelica Salceda is director of democracy, speech, and technology at the ACLU Northern California, right? NorCal? Yeah. And Catherine Heyman is executive director of the Edley Center on Law and Democracy here at the UC Berkeley Law School. And I'm not sure if Angelo Anchetta is going to be here, but if so, he is the senior research and policy counsel for Demos. So hopefully he will join us. We're going to start with a presentation from Eric on some polling numbers from June and August, taking a look at a lot of these questions. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. We all benefit from your journalistic coverage of California, and so it's great to have you with us today. So I'm just going to sort of set the stage a little bit with findings from our June and August polls at IGS. These are polls of California registered voters focused on the state of U.S. democracy. Okay. Oh, it's the share screen thing. There we go. Sorry. So just a couple words about the poll. So the June poll was conducted on behalf of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And it was self-administered surveys completed online. And one of the innovative features of this poll is our standard polls are in English and Spanish. We also had versions of it in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean. So we were able to get an extremely diverse and representative random sample of registered voters. We had over 6,000 respondents, and we applied weights that use statistical ranking procedures to align the sample to the population of registered voters statewide and in the regions of the state. And I just want to echo Scott's point about Mark, maybe before we started, this poll is directed by Mark DiCamillo, and I would say the Dean of California Polling, and somebody we're very proud to have on our team leading this endeavor in general. All right, so a couple things, I just wanted to highlight a couple findings from the poll. So one is we had this question, let me move this away so you can see it. I'm going to try to move it away. Which of the following best describes your view of democracy in the United States today? We asked our sample. And you'll see here that over 60%, about 64% of respondents said that they believe democracy in America is under attack. Another 26% said democracy is being tested, though not under attack. And fewer than 20% of California registered voters said democracy is in no danger, right? And so, one question that I got asked after these, we had these findings is, well, how does this compare to what things looked like 15 or 20 years ago? And the answer is, nobody even bothered to ask that question 15 or 20 years ago. So we don't know for sure, but I think that nobody was asking is indicative of at least a widespread sense that it just was not on people's radar. And so I think it's quite likely the results would look quite different prior to the last several years. And we could talk more about why that's the case. Though I suppose you all have your own working theories of that. And another question to ask is, well, who is it that thinks democracy is under attack? So this shows the percentage of each subgroup of the electorate, or various subgroups of the electorate. See, who is it that thinks democracy is under attack? Well, not surprisingly, Democrats. Over 80% of Democratic voters believe that. It's kind of interesting. Almost 40% of Republicans also believe that. Though I suspect if we had a follow-up about in what ways is it under attack, the Republicans might well give a very different answer than the Democrats. No party preference voters and other party voters are closer to the Democrats on this. Over 60% believe that. One of the striking things that we saw in the poll is not very big racial differences. So white voters over nearly 70%, Latino voters a little bit lower. Some of that is because basically more recent arrivals in the US are less likely to see it. Democracy is under attack. So see something similar with Asian American Pacific Islander voters. We break it down by language use and where you're born and see that pattern. Black voters and white voters look quite similar on this item in California, which I think is interesting. Also, if you look at age groups, the group that sees it under attack the most is older voters, which I think is pretty striking, because we normally think about, older voters maybe being more restrained, more, less likely to go to extremes, so to speak. But I think it's arguable that older voters have the longest time perspective on our politics and therefore see how different this is from the politics they grew up with. All right. We also asked in the poll a question about what we want to delve deeper into attitudes toward democracy. So we looked at voter attitudes toward their government in Sacramento, to the state government. And so we asked this question, well, does special interest money have too much influence or the right amount of influence in Sacramento? And as you'll see here, well, this is the rare area of partisan agreement. Democrats, Republicans, no party preference voters share in the same kind of cynicism or skepticism about our state government and share this concern in special interest money's influence. So this is actually one area of bipartisan consensus. That raised a question for us. Well, who is it that voters trust to do the right thing, and who do they not trust? And so we asked voters about, sorry, I need to, the Zoom. Do we have Zoom on that? I'm sorry. in any case, so we asked voters, how much do you trust Governor Newsom, the legislature, other entities to do the right thing for California voters? And so the dark blue is a lot, light blue is, or bright blue is somewhat, and then yellow is a little, and red is not at all. And what you see there is quite a lot of distrust, right? So the number of people who trust the governor or legislature or the courts a lot is less than 20%. Notice they do better than tech companies and their leaders. 4% trust their tech companies to do the right thing. They do better than business groups. Well, you might ask, well, then who do people trust? Well, labor unions do a little bit better or significantly better, and community nonprofits do better. So there's trust in those entities. But if you think about our elected leaders or these kind of most powerful social groups, not a whole lot of trust. So again, this helps paint a picture of a lot of voter dissatisfaction with how our politics works. All right. So that sort of lays some groundwork. And then in August, we did a follow-up poll. And in that poll, by that time, the ballot proposition that Scott was referring to had come up as a live possibility or was about to be approved by the legislature. So we asked our sample in August whether, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Apologies. We did, this is still the June poll. Apologies for that. We also, one of the concerns about democracy under threat right now is changes coming from Washington that undermine voting rights. And so in recent years, the Supreme Court has scaled back the Voting Rights Act, and it seems quite likely that the Supreme Court is going to weaken it to the point of meaninglessness in the next term. And so we asked our sample of voters, well, if the Supreme Court rolls back the Voting Rights Act further, should California pass laws to recreate its protections, at least within our state? And that's something where you see wide support, over 60% of the full electorate, big majorities of Democrats, over 80%, and no party preference voters as well. Republicans are opposed, though not as unified in opposition of this as on some other issues. And again, you see the same pattern we saw earlier of not very big racial differences on this. So across white voters, Latinos, Black voters, Asian American voters, in each case, about 60% or more support voting rights protections. So it suggests while we have a lot of party polarization in the state of California, we don't have as much racial polarization, at least on these policy questions. All right. Now, sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit. After our June poll, the possibility of a redistricting came onto the horizon in the state in response to Texas. And so we got together with Mark and decided it would be really good to poll on this. And so we were one of the first outfits in the field with a poll on this proposition. And fortunately, I think we worded it with, thanks to Mark's guidance, it was written in a way that as very closely corresponds to what voters will face in November. Some of the other polling that came up with some different results, we would argue was quite different from what voters are facing. So we asked voters, if there is this ballot measure to temporarily replace the district lines, if Texas goes forward with its redistricting plan, would you vote no or yes on this, emphasizing it's in effect through 2030? And so here's what our survey showed. Statewide, about 48% said they would vote yes, 32% said they'd vote no, and 20% said they'd vote undecided. 20% were undecided. And as you might expect, you see a big partisan split. Democrats about 70% in favor, only about 11% opposed. Republicans overwhelmingly opposed, and those no party preference voters leaning positive, though a lot of undecided. And so you might ask, well, what does this portend for November? Well, one rule of thumb with ballot propositions is that you want to be above 50% yes, well ahead of the vote, because historically, undecideds tend to break against ballot propositions once they get negative messages about them. So 48 is really close to 50. So it's not in a bad position, but it's also not a slam dunk by any means. I think if you look a little bit more under the hood, though, of the results, I think there are reasonably good reasons for Democrats to be at least cautiously optimistic. And so one key finding is if you look at the people who turn out and vote all the time, our regular voters, they're more supportive. They're above 50%. They're about 55% in favor, 35% opposed. So a bigger margin among the regular voters, whereas the less regular voters, less reliable, are more split. And in a low turnout November 2025 election, it's probably going to be a lot of these hardcore voters. Another pattern that I think gives some reason for optimism is if you look at the undecided voters, right? There are a lot of undecided voters, and a lot of them are in groups that tend to be Democratic leaning. So a lot of undecided Latino voters, see that green bar, almost 30%. A lot of undecided Black voters, about 27%. Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, similar, and also young voters. All of those groups are quite undecided. And so the big challenge for Democrats in their messaging is going to be to persuade those folks, give them messaging about why this is good for causes they care about, and then turn them out to vote. And so really this is going to be a battle about getting voters engaged and informed and then turning them out. And so I think we're already starting to see that ad war, and that's going to be really pivotal over the next several weeks. All right, so that's my overview. Thanks so much, and look forward to the discussion.
Want to acknowledge also that Angelo has, we already introduced you. You were here, so we got a seat for you here.
Apologize, my flag gave me the wrong turn, took several wrong turns before I even got on board.
No worries, no worries.
It's quite a trick to get over here.
No worries.
Sorry.
Let me begin just by asking each of you a question about the challenge faced by both sides. 2/3 of ballot measures in California roughly fail. This is a complicated question. It's not like, should we legalize pot? Yes or no? You know, no one knows what gerrymandering is, really. So what do you all see? What's at stake in the passage or failure of this? How do you see that? And what would you say to people who, you know, are among those undecided voters? What should they consider? Angela, you want to go first?
Sure. And it was part of my introduction that I used to be a commissioner.
Oh, no, but I should have one. So Angelo was the first one, right? First commission, which drew the lines after the 2008 ballot measure Prop 11 passed, and drew the lines for the 2012 election. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, that's important. Thank you.
Yeah, because there are, if you've been sort of tracking who's come out publicly on this, there's been 2 Democratic commissioners from my commission. At least one Republican, one independent. I think there'll be one Democrat in favor of Prop 15. I am one of 29, 30 people who are former or current commissioners. I'm going to vote no, but it's not a strong no by any means. And there are plenty of good arguments to say, yes, you want to vote on this because it's really necessary. So I'm going to acknowledge that there are several counter arguments here, but the rhetoric on both sides is quite hyperbolic, in my opinion. Republicans are saying they're trying to save democracy. Democrats are saying they're trying to save democracy. Commissions are, in my opinion, a better way to do redistricting than having legislatures do it. But having a legislature do it is a democratic process. Those are elected officials. It's a kind of legislation. So it isn't necessarily evil, in my opinion, that legislation, plenty of legislation.
Could you be persuaded to vote yes?
Unlikely. Unlikely. I thought about this quite a bit. And I wasn't sure if I was even going to come publicly. And several of the commissions probably won't come out publicly.
Why?
They might want to lean toward no, but really they'd want to see it pass.
Yeah.
Frankly.
Anybody else want to jump in? And Helga, maybe, what's at stake? You sit with the ACLU Northern California. Have they taken a position?
No, so our organization before, we're comprised of 3 affiliates, so Northern California, Southern California, San Diego, and Peril counties. Every board has to vote. And so they're going through that process now. So we don't have an official position, but I think one thing that I often think about and that will be interesting to see is who actually does come out to vote. And I say that because when this issue was first circulating, just having conversations with friends, they're like, redistricting what? And so my joke is also then like, we all care about redistricting. So I hope everyone cares about redistricting in 2030 and everyone is as enthusiastic about it. But this is just an interesting moment that I think really the framing, how this is framed is going to be important for voters. I think the other thing that's going to be really critical is that depending on the messaging, so the messaging is, you know, if you vote yes, this is our way to fight against this administration, then we're still going to have to face the question of, is this going to have an impact overall? If we're seeing Missouri already engaging in this, Texas, so will the numbers will there actually be a change in Congress or not? And is that going to matter for voters if they think that this is their way to fight against the administration, but then if that actually doesn't sort of realize in the numbers in Congress? So those are the things that I'm sort of thinking about as a voter myself, and that will, I think, matter in how this is framed and how folks end up voting.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I pretty strongly believe in the privacy of the vote, so I'm not sharing my upcoming vote. But I also, I run a center that's focused on law and democracy, and our job right now, mine at the center, but I think all of us as members of communities, is to think about what we want our democracy to do for us. And so as much as I agree with you about what in the abstract is the right way to draw lines and to determine when and how we vote and for whom, we are in a different time. We are not in a time when our president is asking for aspirational satisfaction of our democracy principles. Our president has been super clear that what he wants is 5 more Republicans, period. So, you know, that's not about making sure that we have democracy guardrails in place. That's not about making sure that we have a fair vote. That's about nakedly partisan, corrupt practices from a president. So this is an opportunity to put a check on that. Whatever else you think, including however you typically vote. This is a moment. Whether the answer comes out the way that you might or might not like, this is your opportunity to check a corrupt president who is anti-democratic and to stand for democracy. So that feels to me like a principled response, a principled way to evaluate what's in front of us, understanding that this is temporary, understanding that the plan is to go back to what we have said we wanted in a time when we're operating like an actual democracy, which is not the time.
I'm gonna mark you down as a yes.
Challenge, just a challenge to make a counter argument. So I think when in thinking about this, is just to think about this question is, will it in fact be temporary, right? Even though the proposed amendment does say only for a certain number of cycles, but I think you have to think long and hard about whether the Democratic Party will want to give up, most likely lose 5 seats in the post 2030 cycle, because if it goes back to the commission is not going to draw the same, because this is a clearly partisan, it's not a strongly partisan redistricting, but it is their design. It's designed to add more Democratic seats, and you know they're cutting up certain districts. Sure, they're shifting things around. This is a very wonky topic, but bottom line is you have more Democratic leaning seats under this plan.
Eric, as you said, there's like 20% undecided voters. Maybe they're lower information voters. They've got some time. Ballots are growing out in a couple of weeks, though, so they don't have a lot of time. But it seems like the message of let's save democracy is a little complicated, because through democracy, we got Prop 11 and the Citizens Commission, which drew the lines. Any polling I've ever seen, people like that. You know, recently they like that. And if you didn't ask the question, but if you ask people, do you want politicians to draw the lines, or do you want an independent Citizens Commission to draw the line? I'm guessing Citizens Commission is going to do pretty well. So how do you think about that question of how do you say that Prop 50 is going to save democracy when in effect it's kind of undoing it?
Well, I mean, so I think that there's a clear tension here between what's right for the state and its voters on its own terms, on their own terms, and what's right for the state and their voters with respect to national politics, right? So that, and that's really what's changed. It used to be each state drew its own lines with the primary focus on that state's voters and politicians, right? And so there'd be gerrymandering goes way back, and each state would do it to protect the interests of the politicians in that state, right? What's happened in recent decades is politics has become nationalized. And the most important question, many would argue, in a House, in electing a member of the House of Representatives, is who do they vote for speaker on the first day? Because if they vote for a Democrat, that gives rise to one kind of politics. If they vote for a Republican, it's a very different set of outcomes. You know, the difference between Nancy Pelosi as speaker and Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy, pretty vast, right? And so what happens is, as voters are deciding, they have to think about two different things, right? One is, what are my principles about my state and its internal politics? And then what's the impact on national politics? And that's always been a tension, but it's become much sharper in recent years. And so when Texas does their mid-decade redistricting, that has nothing to do with Texas's own politics. It's all about affecting the national balance of power. And so the problem for Democrats is that Democratic states have over the years been more in favor of commission reforms. And so they've adopted reforms that suit their state's interests, that tie the hands of politicians. You know, it's improved. When I teach this in my Congress class, you know, it's improved competitiveness. It's had all these benefits, right? But if one party does that and the other doesn't, and the other party pushes their advantages all the way to the hill, then for the party, that creates a real dilemma. And people will resolve it different ways, right? But the message for the pro folks has to be, you know, this is about control of national institutions. This is about is there a check on Donald Trump or not? That's what their message is going to be. And the way I think about it, just very practically, you brought up the great point that other Republican states are doing this. So it's not, California will offset Texas if this passes. It won't offset those other 5 seats. But the difference between it passing or not is, do Republicans gain 11 or 12 seats by redistricting this cycle, or do they gain about 5 or 6 seats?
Well, that assumes it's not a way of election, right?
Well, no, just by redistricting. I'm saying just from the redistricting. So in other words, how big does the wave have to be, right? So one estimates I've seen say basically, if this passes in California, Democrats need to win the popular vote nationwide by about 2 points to take back the House. Yeah. If it fails, they need to win it by about 4 points to take back the House. So you need so it's possible they still win. It's not like they can't, but it becomes a higher hill, right? And so that's a complicated message for Newsom to convey, but I think that's the challenge, is to try to get voters to think national stakes, and the no vote is going to be, but we like this process, and that's the tension.
We've seen over the last few years, people like Donald Trump and many others questioning the integrity of elections and of our democracy. You have that question about, is our democracy under attack or under threat? What impact do any of you think that this campaign, and people are going to be inundated with ads, we already are, but they're going to raise between 150 and $200 billion combined. What impact do you think, as they're thinking about the question that you framed, how are people going to feel about elections, given that they voted for Prop 11? Now, maybe people don't think about it that way, but just in general, this whole discussion, what's at stake, the fact that they're being asked on November 4th to cast a vote, which is a weird time of the year. What do they think? What impact is that going to have on the way they think about our democracy and about elections?
Well, look, I think we always have to be worried about that question, right? We have seen in the data that you shared that this is a very polarized time, and we have low confidence in our democracy in general. So what do people think about elections? They don't think that much right now about them, and they don't feel now like their vote matters and like they're voting for something that touches them. So we need to change that, separate and apart from Proposition 50 and this coming November. We need to change that period, because we need people to be confident in our democracy and their participation. I'll say I grew up in a family where my grandmother, my mother admonished me over and over and over. People died for this right. You will vote every election, every time, and I do. But we all need to be holding that this was not something that was a guarantee. People didn't want me to vote twice over, over a lot of time. And I'm gonna use that, that's my power, and I'm gonna influence my communities. We all need to hold that, and we need to feel like that's gonna matter for us, and so we need to be communicating that, and I don't think Proposition 50 in this November are the thing that tips that balance out of the way.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Well, it's a referendum on Trump and Trumpism and Republican Congress. That's how it's framed. That's how it's been framed. I do not buy the rhetoric that the Republicans are trying to save democracy. It's not. And by the way, if you know how this commission, the independent commission works, there's not a secret, but there's a quota at the heart of this commission. There's an affirmative action quota for Republicans. Because if you look at how it's structured, there's a membership, because there are 5 who go to the largest party, 5 who go to the second largest party, 4 to the others. So that means 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, or others. If you look at registration, Democrats are about 40–45%, Republicans are about 25%. The other is picking up steam, they're up around 40–45% as well. So there's an imbalance. It's currently, I'm sure don't know the math, but there's an imbalance in the seats and the proportionality of the seats. So if you are a Republican, you love this commission because you always get 5 seats. Now you can't always get what you want because there are supermajority votes. There's various structures that are built in to promote consensus on the commission, not uniformity all of them. But the commission itself is, again, in my opinion, a much more transparent, more open way of doing things. But it's not anti-democratic to have a legislature. But will there be incumbency protection? Will there be partisanship? Will there be a lack of transparency? Absolutely. That's the way it was. That's how it still happens.
In the last election, 2024, there were 4 or 5 congressional seats that were truly competitive, which was very high compared to most states, because most states draw the lines in a way to protect the incumbents. And a lot of people would say that's part of the problem in Washington, because these seats are so drawn to advantage one party or the other, that the big concern, there's no incentive to collaborate and cooperate and compromise. It's all about fear of being primaried from your left, if you're a Democrat, or from your right, if you're a Republican. So what impact is this if it passes? Because these districts are going to be more skewed than they are now. They're not drawn independently. They're drawn in to advantage one party. Like, does that matter? Or is the democracy thing bigger? Is it a bigger question?
I don't think it's a given that the districts will be more skewed. We have a very beautiful commission that is a beautiful design. And the results here and in other states are that we actually still have skewed districts. So, we have a theory and then we have a practice. It's not a given that we're going to have more skewed districts as a result. And we're also talking about a limited time period. We don't know how people will vote later. We don't know what people will think in an uncertain future, but we know right now what we're asking for is that this is true.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? In terms of messaging, there were 20%, and I don't remember if that was likely voters or just all voters, 20% undecided. A lot of them ended up voting no or don't vote at all. What messages do you think are going to persuade people who haven't made up their mind one way or the other? I realize you're not political scientists or campaign consultants.
Maybe they've been talking to people who've been walking precincts about this. So I will say, already, 1 in 4 of the people walking precincts on this are new to walking precincts. At this stage, early in voting, you would typically see all the people to be people who always turn out and always show up. There's 1 in 4 people who are out there walking because they care enough about this, they're worried enough about it, that they're out there going door to door talking about it. That is a very interesting sign about this kind of wonky issue and how people feel about it. What they're saying back to me in my dinner table conversations is that when they walk, Republican voters are saying, I don't know, I do think that there should be a check on Donald Trump. That's fascinating to me to be hearing that back. That he's going too far and it's important to have some kind of check. Democrat, undecided voters, a little bit like, what is this actually about? How is this going to affect me? What does this mean? But it's interesting to me to hear that Republican responsiveness to, yes, we actually do need a check because this is too much.
In the last election, one of the things that characterized the presidential vote was the number of voters of color, Black men, especially Latino men, moving to the right, voting more for Donald Trump than they did in 2020 or 2016. We saw a lot of undecided voters, are Latino, Asian American, AAPI, Black. What do you think, are messages that they're going to care about?
Yeah. So so first on the shifting voting of people of color, I think in California, I think it's less dramatic than in some other places, is my sense.
Depends on where.
And I also think that some of our poll, it's certainly our polling suggests that, for example, among Latino communities, a lot of concern about the immigration crackdown and reaction, some pretty strong opinions, not just confined to that community, but that's one of the ones that you hear the most about moving to the right. And so I think that, it's likely overstated in California, that shift. However, I do think that, the messages are going to be, I think, dinner table. I think it's got to be, do you like how things are going in Washington? And if not, this is an opportunity to stop and change that. And I think it's got to be that kind of simple message in terms of trying to get those undecided voters, they're still overwhelmingly pretty strongly Democratic, those undecided voters. And so appealing to them on checking Donald Trump, I think, is the most powerful argument. Just as, for the yes side, for the no side, they want to make this about don't have politicians in charge of districts. We don't want to go back to that. And the no side, I think, has just that alternative frame of understanding this is about Donald Trump. This is about national power, getting people to see it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing for me. How successful they'll be able to link this measure to what's going on, what's actually impacting people's lives, whether they be, immigration raids. And then the other thing that I think many of us are thinking about is that what are folks going to be thinking about any threats to themselves when they're going to go to the ballot box? And as folks are thinking about the possibility of ICE enforcement or National Guard, how is that? I think many of us are thinking, is that going to have an impact in who's going out? Of course, we have folks who are going to get their ballots in the mail. And we were just talking about this earlier, that it's sort of there's been a shift in a sense that there was a point where a lot of people were voting by mail. I think this last election, we saw more people actually start going to the polls, and what impact that might have on folks who want to show up and vote.
Yeah, just on that point, one of the questions we had in our June poll, I don't want to get the wording wrong, but it's something like, do you feel comfortable voting in person? And, a fair number of voters say that they have at least some significant reservations about voting in person. But we didn't, in that survey, have the chance to ask follow-ups about exactly what people are worried about. Is it violence? Is it federal government? What is it they're worried about? I do think that, people cannot take for granted the idea that everybody feels free to participate, and which is one reason the mail voting option in California is, likely does make a difference.
I'm wondering what impact do you think, any of you, the assassination of Charlie Kirk is going to have on all of this? Because especially if the yes side is running a campaign, Donald Trump at the center of it all, and he seems to be getting ready, to sort of crack down on dissent and groups that disagree with him. Is that it's terrible for the country, but is it good for the Yes on 50 campaign, you think? Is that the kind of thing that moves voters?
I want to come out quickly and say political violence is not going to bring it, period.
I don't mean, yeah.
No, I know
yeah,
that,
yeah,
but I think we just want to be really clear. Like, there's nothing to celebrate about political violence ever. And the political violence, I don't have a prediction about how it weighs on people's thinking about something on the ballot. I do think it has a lot to do with how people will feel about showing up to vote and how safe they will feel about showing up to vote. So, that's a scary reality. It's already impacting people's willingness to come and speak at events like this, right? And their willingness to put themselves out there, period. And I think it will affect people's willingness to go in person, to exercise the core fundamental precept of a democracy.
Any other thoughts about things that Trump does between now and the election? He's currently signed off on sending National Guard troops to Memphis, Tennessee. Now he's talked about, they're already, I think, in Chicago. He's talked about Oakland. I mean, is that, again, maybe not good for the country, but is that the kind of thing that you think people will motivate people one way or the other? A lot of people think it's fine.
I guess the way I think it's more symptomatic of just I think people, I guess what I would say is there've been enough events already this year that if people, that for voters, those who are inclined to be worried about the state of American democracy in terms of threats from President Trump, I think that the number of episodes they have to point to is already like a lot. And so I'm not sure what another thing is going to do. But I do think that this general, our initial poll, the question about is democracy under attack? I think the what happened and then the aftermath of it just brings home, as a political scientist, the way I think about it is every time I think I've revised my view of how much danger we're in up to the right level, it turned out I was underestimating, right? And I think that's something that ordinary voters are seeing too, and so, yeah, that to me is the most worrisome sign, and clearly has the potential to affect individuals deciding to participate or not. There's more and more fear, and sometimes fear and worry can prime people to go out and participate, and sometimes it can demobilize. And I think that's going to be one of the big things to watch over the next several months.
We are going to give you all a chance to ask some questions, so be thinking of what those might be. Catherine, there were a couple of legal challenges by Republicans to this whole process of putting this on the ballot. They were both rejected by the state Supreme Court. Do you see any other weaknesses to any of this, even if it passes? Might it be held up in court?
It's very hard to predict what will happen in court these days. I've been very pleased with our California Supreme Court and how protective they are of our Voting Rights Act and how protective they are of our equality principles. But I am no longer in the business of predicting what decisions.
But do you see things as someone who, as a lawyer, who that there are potential vulnerabilities to this measure?
Well, it's a first. It is inconsistent with what we have said we were going to do, and it's a promise about what's to come. So there's always vulnerabilities, and I think that they have been very clear, very upfront about all of those, including in the way that is described. So if I were predicting, which I just said I'm not, I would be reasonably confident about it.
Dick, I think there'll be an unsuccessful challenge using the Voting Rights Act by Republicans. They won't win.
On what basis? How?
They're either packing in some areas of Southern California, or there's some delation. I don't know. I don't know that there's any merit to that, but I think they will try to do that. They tried to do that in the 2011 cycle. Nobody tried it last cycle, but I suspect they will try to do that. They won't win, and they may try.
Yeah, I'm curious, and Eric, I'll put this to you first. What do you think is at stake for Gavin Newsom? He created the FB election. He had this podcast. Charlie Kirk was his first guest. Yeah. It was widely panned because it seemed like he was sort of pandering. Although he was now the first, I think, politician, first Democrat certainly to come out and condemn the violence. But what do you think is at stake for him? He obviously is looking to potentially run for president. What do you think? He's not on the ballot, but what impact could it have on him?
Yeah, no, the stakes for Newsom are high. He's had I think something of a struggle to find his appeal to Democratic activist voters for a primary to run for president. He tried that initial, podcast tour, and I think it did not seem to me to help him with that.
Those numbers went down.
And then since then, though, he's really tried to position himself very clearly as the anti-Trump. The mocking him on Twitter, or on X, which doesn't appeal, it's not going to register in polls, but Democratic activists notice that. They think, oh, this is somebody taking on Trump and kind of show he can stand up to him. And so this is like exhibit one for Newsom in proving I'm the one who can fight Trump effectively. So if this goes down, that really hurts that message. So if it succeeds, you know, I still would not put him at all as the favorite in 2028, but it gives him at least some basis to run and have a narrative that whereas if he loses this, I think it's a real blow to his prestige.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? In terms of messengers, the literature that voters are going to get in the voter guide, the argument for Prop 80, Prop 50 are Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, and Alex Padilla, who's a U.S. Senator. He was the Secretary of State. I'm not sure who's signing the no side, but like I'm wondering, especially in communities of color, there are large numbers of, as you said earlier, people of color who are undecided. Like, who would persuade? Is there Arnold Schwarzenegger? I mean, who? I guess I'm wondering, like, why aren't there athletes or cultural figures, musicians who are out there, or maybe they're afraid to stick their necks out? But any thoughts about like who would move voters in one way or the other?
I don't think what you described is mutually exclusive. I mean, you've identified the three people who will be on the ballot that we will be looking at. And you know, those are three terrific leaders. People have strong feelings about them. You know, that's lovely. And there will be more voices out there also. So we also may well see athletes and entertainers and others.
It's still early.
Taking positions, right?
Yeah. Any thoughts about what kind of messaging would work with voters of color?
Well, again, I think the strongest message is you got to stop Trump. You got to stop Trump. It's really important to stop Trump. That's ultimately the core message. This is, you know, I think we agree on 99%. This is so bad. It's so bad. My God. But we don't like the solution. You like it better than I do, but no one really likes doing this, but it's so bad right now. You've got to do something. And picking up some seats is one way, but it's so hard to think because of the national. I'm really concerned that we're in the middle of an arms race and the numbers are going to skew the other way, that you're actually going to end up with net losses on the Democratic side. So I don't know what's going to happen in these other states. And I'm not saying that disarming when Texas has launched something is the better way to go necessarily, because we don't know exactly how they might have stopped at 5. Okay, that's enough. Missouri or Ohio.
I'm getting you to yes.
But no, you're getting me, yeah. But I get it, and if it passes, well. So here's my point about this commission, right? If you really want California to be a national player and make a difference nationally, give it back to the legislators. If that's what you really, really want, because that's very outcome driven. If you are more concerned about democratic processes and openness and transparency and not letting incumbents give themselves their own districts, then you want to keep a commission. And I have strong concerns about the permanence of the commission past 2030. I think if this passes, I think there will be an initiative in 2028 that will say we need to keep this up. We need to maintain this. We need to be a player in national politics. We love the commission for state legislative districts, for the Board of Equalization, but for national politics, we have to do it differently because we're California and the rest of the states. Trumpism is not dead yet. We're alive and well. We need to counter that. And that's a very powerful argument. It's very powerful. Yeah.
It's very powerful to you, who knows a lot about elections, right? I mean, I actually think that the thing that, and I don't disagree with that, and it's a policy matter, but I think that the bigger lift for November or any mid-cycle election is to get people to go at all, to think about this is time to vote. It's outside, it's not when I would usually.
Why do I care?
And then to understand something that's super wonky.
Yeah. All right, let's take some of your questions. If you have one, put your hand up. Ask. All you smart people must have asked.
So I'm very surprised to hear that the Republicans can win this arm race, because I think that I think that at least I understood before today that the more right-wing states are more jerry-rigged than the left-wing states, and so it seems like that if Missouri can scrape up another seat, which I kind of doubt they can since they're so jerry-rigged, the Democrat states can counter.
Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are a couple things. So they can, in Missouri, they could get one, possibly even two, because the Voting Rights Act is no longer going to be a constraint. That they thought it was a constraint before, And so that it was, so it's not quite fully gerrymandered. They can go further. But the key thing is Republicans have unified control in many more states, than Democrats. And then in several of the Democratic states, you have a commission or some, you have constraints. So New York has this bizarre process, but basically New York is not fully gerrymandered. If it were fully gerrymandered, that would give Democrats several more seats. They have their act together much less than California Democrats. They talk about doing it, but have not moved at all.
What about New Jersey?
Constrained, but I'm not 100. I don't remember exact nature of it. But yeah, Colorado is constrained is another example. And so, so there just are fewer opportunities for Democrats. I mean, you're right. Republicans have pushed it more, but there still is space, especially without the Voting Rights Act and vote dilution claims, which I think are likely to go away.
Case pending, yeah.
There's a rehearing this term,
Yeah.
Supreme Court.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, right here.
Hi, thank you. I was just curious about, like hypothetically, Prop 50 does pass, how will that affect accessibility and representation for communities of color and minorities? And I feel like I don't want to assume that these 5 additional Democratic seats are equally representing those minoritized or marginalized communities.
Any thoughts?
I haven't analyzed the map, so.
Okay, well, I have, so. I mean, there's actually not a guarantee in the state, and that's a little bit about the ways people are moving and where people are in the state. And it's a little bit about Central California and how Republican or not people are in those communities. And so I think there, I mean, obviously the governor has a fairly high degree of confidence in what would happen with the map drawing, but it is projecting into an uncertain future at a time when people are unlikely to vote in the numbers that we can expect. And so it's a little nail-bitey kind of either way.
Thank you.
Other questions right here? Okay. Yeah, you look like you're looking for the microphone.
You could tell. Well, thank you for the conversation today. I'm a graduate student at the Goldman School of Public Policy. We had a great conversation on Friday about democracy policy.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about the initial poll results findings and really the bipartisan agreement that there is a problem with our democracy as we understand it today. What would a policy agenda, maybe at the national level, but also to the disproportionate role that California can play, not only because we're home to so many voters, but because we're also where maybe 1 or 2 hours away, depending on traffic, we have some major corporations that are very influential in how information is perhaps contributing to some of these perceptions of our democracy. So what would a national agenda look like? And what would a state agenda look like to help promote more participation and buy-in to democratic norms?
Well, that's a big question. Let me mention one thing, because I don't know if this came. So obviously, I think there is strong support, both in pro and some of the no vote on 50, for congressional legislation to basically outlaw mid-decade redistricting and to move towards some sort of commission system. Now, whether that ever will pass, who knows? Right? So I think that's an example of some federal reforms, which I think would be constitutional and would be, if it could happen. Your question goes to a rather basic and difficult and challenging question, which is to try to develop in this time and this world an agenda that is actually that is a pro-democracy agenda. You mentioned sort of corporate influence and trying to address money in politics and campaign finance reform and other kinds of areas where we're thinking that there's an outsized influence among big business and other kinds of corporate interests too. So there are lots of places to turn to. I don't know if there's one single, I know you have a particular agenda. Your center, my office has particular agendas in terms of money in politics and other kinds of democratic reforms. I think most of us are feeling very much in the defensive mode, though. We're not feeling we can get too much going, except in places like California, where you can get some stuff going in Sacramento. But in a lot of ways, California is actually ahead of the game in a lot of spaces. Lagging in a few other spaces, but it's doing pretty well. But the challenge is what are you going to do in these other states where things are really moving backwards and in significant ways? They're in lockstep with what the president is pushing, which is, I think, a greater threat because you're seeing swing states like Michigan, Ohio, they're thinking of enacting documented proof of citizenship requirements. They're thinking various forms of voter purges going on. Loosening campaign finance restrictions. Lots of defensive work that has to happen at the state and local level. So I think there's a lot to do in a lot of places, and I think it's hard to we can look long term. I think long term, I mean like 10, 15, 20 years down the line about moving in a certain direction. But we're not at that place right now. I think we're in a very, very defensive mode in a lot of places. And in California, we have a chance to kind of move this forward. But in a lot of places, it's just trying to hold ground.
Can I give a few suggestions so we just released a report with some recommendations that we could do here in California. And so we're talking about all the things that have been rolled back at the federal level or things that we're concerned about. And so the report talks about like, let's codify a version of Section 2 in our state law. We don't have pre-clearance.
Say what that is.
So the Federal Voting Rights Act, which was passed in the 60s, we first had Shelby County, the decision in 2013, that basically eviscerated Section 5. So Section 5 meant that a lot of localities, this meant a lot of southern states, before they made any change, they had to notify the federal government, and the federal government had to sign off on it. After Shelby County, that's when we started seeing an increase in all of these strict voter ID laws, closing of polling locations, and we can imagine where those locations were in the communities of color. And so then we're left with Section 2, which was what we tend to use as a way to challenge any vote dilution issues that we see in jurisdictions, whether it be cities or counties or states. And there's been a few decisions, including Berdovich, that has made it harder to bring racial discrimination claims under Section 2. And so the prediction is we're also not going to have that anymore. The Supreme Court at some point is going to say,
It's all fixed.
And so then the question is, are there things that we have all been lamenting that we no longer have available through our federal voting rights laws that we can think about that makes sense for California to enact? And so those are some of the things that we've been thinking at our organization that we think makes sense for California.
Yeah, and there are other states. I mean, there are. California has a voting rights act of its own, but it's not as extensive as what you're seeing in more recent years in places like New York, Connecticut, Colorado, New Jersey, Virginia. Connecticut is probably the best one. I think it's the best. It's one of the more recent ones where there's quite extensive repair work and really trying to replicate what has been gutted in the federal law and then expanding it in a lot of important ways. For example, language access is quite expansive in some of the newer state voting rights acts. So I think those are what they're looking into. So model policies or things to kind of say things are actually moving pretty well. But again, blue states, right? In other states, not going anywhere anytime soon. So there's a lot of different places we have to go. Well, defense here, offense here, hold the ground as best we can in these kind of swing states. So there's a lot of different places to kind of look at.
I think our pro-democracy agenda has to certainly be about voting and, that central precursor to participation in democracy. But it also has to be about what are we for? And what are we asking for? What are we doing? How do we want our government to work for us? And so that, it's got to be about hope. It's got to be about actually what is it that we need? And what are we asking for? What are we committing to in our communities? Because I also think that'll help us with voting, right? People will vote if there's something to vote for. And there's something to believe in. So here and nationally, we need a pro-democracy agenda has to be focused that way.
Other questions, right? Oh, behind me. Oh, thank you. Need a rear view mirror.
I know, sorry.
The sitting room only.
We got the hot seats over here. I'm a high school history teacher.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And this comes up definitely seniors, so that's government class, and we talk about gerrymandering. And then you see the looks on their faces where they're like, well, why should I bother? So what's your answer? Because you're just talking about we need them to hope, we need them to vote, but you explain gerrymandering and they're like, yeah, my vote doesn't count, especially on a national level in a state like California. So how do we get them to vote even when we can actually show them the numbers that their vote isn't going to change anything?
So We tell them about my grandmother, who says people died for this right, so you gotta use it. We tell them that school boards matter and the city council matters and that, you know, that their local election matters. And so it's just not right that their vote doesn't count. And we tell them if you sit it out, your vote for sure doesn't count. So you go and you actually make sure that you are part of your democracy, period. And it's a beautiful thing to go to, I mean, you know, this, like, when you go to the polls and you cast your ballot and you were part of democracy, even when the outcome isn't the one that you wanted, you were participating. It's beautiful. They should have that.
So here's a phrase to tell them. It's the one that a lot of reformers like to use, which is voters should choose elected officials. Elected officials shouldn't choose the voters. Because when you gerrymander, you're picking your voters, right? And if you live in a gerrymandered district, if you're not in the majority in that district, you'll never win. Your side will never win. And that's because somebody picked you as a voter not to be in the majority. They picked someone else to be in the majority. That kind of resonates. I mean, oh, really? That makes a difference if they draw the line differently? Yeah, because people vote where they happen to live, and you know that's how districts work, and it's representing a location and a group of people within a geographic space. And if you give it, and this is again for the reformers, like you don't want to see politicians do it, but if you say, well, it's not really good for them to do it because they're picking you, you should be the one picking them, right? That's how democracy is supposed to work. The voters choose the elected officials, not the other way around. So that may resonate there. It's on that topic.
We have more here. We're gonna say, no.
So I think I actually probably missed the news. So I have a friend named Bonnie Glasser who is she got her PhD here at IGS, and she worked on the redistricting system where it's supposed to more or less, I guess, either algorithmically or there's some heuristic that every time a census is taken, it balances out each districts to try to have half Democrat, half Republican. So what happened to that?
Well, this is a question of just sort of algorithmic or using computer.
They're not really trying to balance Democrats.
No, you can't do it. You can't. Impossible in California. Right? You can't do it. That's just not the way.
It was supposed
California. Well, you could. So somebody has to someone always programs the computer program, right? So the values you insert into the program, which will be reflected in the outcomes or multiple outcomes that a program or simulation will develop, are going to reflect those values. And if you say, balance the parties, right? You can come up with a map. It's going to be weird, the weirdest looking thing you've ever seen, right? Try to have an even split in San Francisco or Peril. Yeah. How can you possibly do that? It's not going to happen, right? So there are competing values. I mean, they have to all be equal population. They have to not violate the Constitution or not violate the Voting Rights Act. You're trying to preserve different kinds of boundaries. So there's lots of different criteria. And again, if you're injecting partisanship, which you're not supposed to into the current system, but if you are in a place where you can, and sometimes at the local level that is the case, partisanship creeps in. Yeah, you're going to get different lines. So depending on how you program that computer, it's going to come out different. There are ways of using computers in a smart way, to develop what might be illegal or unconstitutional versions, and just see, well, how does this map the people develop compare with one that the computer says, oh, well, this is going to be a little problematic if you do it this way. Yeah. So there are uses for computers, but I wouldn't turn it over to a computer, certainly.
Other questions? Yep, in the back. Sorry, we don't let reporters ask questions.
Oh, well, I'm a taxpayer here. Even when you're polling about trust, and Newsom's sort of middling at best trust numbers, is he a liability at the center of the campaign for the pro-yes side?
Eric?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think our numbers suggest his approval has bumped up a little bit in the state since he went more on the offense against Trump. So our August poll, showed in, I forget the exact numbers, Mark could tell you.
He went up about 8 points in our latest poll, but it's a good question. And, I'm thinking about our next poll, and I think a lot of the questions will be about Newsom and the people who will be spokespersons. And I have to think that Schwarzenegger's name is going to be included somewhere in that mix. Yeah. And somehow I think if you poll on Schwarzenegger vis-a-vis Newsom, I think Schwarzenegger may come out ahead. So there's some vulnerability there. But it is an issue that we're gonna examine as we can, as much as we can, if we do this last poll.
Just to follow up though to Joe's question, that 8-point bump, how much of that was among Democrats? And how much of it was like decline to state no party preference voters who usually decide the outcome of these things, right?
It was, no party preference voters went up. And the interesting thing about Democrats was they moved from favor somewhat to favor strongly, which I thought was a significant thing because we always have a 4-point scale and his strongly approved numbers went up. So I thought that was significant and it was mainly because he's going after Trump and the Democrats want him to go after Trump.
Yeah.
And that seemed to have that appeal and that's what I think was behind most.
How does that play though with no party preference voters?
Well, some of them are behind. I mean, if you look at no party preference voters in California,
They lean down.
they're 2-to-1 Democrat if you ask them, how do you identify? So they're more like, I always think the no party preference voters are reflective of the overall electorate.
Yeah,
I mean, the default.
which is not a good sign for the US, at least in that poll, because it's under 50, right? It's like 47 or less.
I'm not gonna predict this outcome.
There's so many things influencing polls right now. Another question, yes.
I have a question about going back to messaging and who the people are and money. The no side, I'm sorry, the yes side is out there and we know Pelosi and Gavin are raising just a whole lot of money for this. Where is the no side? Mark mentioned Schwarzenegger, but where else is the no side and what will their tactics be?
I think most of their money so far has come from Charles Munger. It's a buddy of Warren Buffett. It was one of the head of Berkshire Hathaway Berkshire. I'm not a big investor. So he's got a lot of money.
An original funder of the
Prop 11, yeah.
Prop 11,
Yeah.
But
I guess
who else?
Yeah. But who else? Yeah.
Kevin
That's good.
McCarthy.
Kevin McCarthy.
But he's raising money.
He's
not
raising
giving
money,
Yeah.
And what about the business community, the chamber, the usual suspects in the Republican Party?
It's a good question. I mean, I do wonder in this climate of like, sort of fear and retribution, does that influence, who's going to stick out, who wants to have their name and their employer on a list of contributions?
Yeah, I mean, I've been noticing, it seems like I've seen more no ads than yes ads. And so it makes me wonder, are the yes side raising as much money? You would assume with Nancy Pelosi and Newsom that they'll be successful. I'm a little surprised they haven't started advertising in full force because with those undecideds, you want to kind of control the message early on. But my gut has always been this is going to be lots of money on both sides. And so they'll each be able
I'm
to get
getting
the message
daily
out.
texts and emails from Governor Newsom.
Yeah, no, the text, but you're not, the air war stuff.
I have not seen anything on the air.
I guess like what if you're trying to raise money, whether you're Kevin May, what's that?
The YouTube ad spend for the no side has been intended. It's being a lot of ads on the no side, particularly on YouTube.
Yeah, if you're trying to raise money, you're Nancy Pelosi or whoever, Kevin McCarthy, like what's in it? What's the pitch to a potential donor? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think
what's in
it's
it for them?
simple. I mean, it's the same reason they give to congressional candidates to win the majority. I mean, what we have is, it used to be you gave to a congressional candidate because you like that individual candidate. Now, many more people give to congressional candidates because they want their party to rule. And so that's what the yes side, Democrats, we want to take the House. This is how we take the House. For Republicans on the no side, this is how we stop them from taking the House. And that'll raise a lot of money with big segment of big pocketed donors. Though you're right, you could imagine some business groups and so on being a little reluctant at this moment.
Well, we saw how quickly the tech community flipped then. Yes, right here.
So you mentioned how you mentioned how gerrymandering in the past has largely been to protect states' interests, and we're moving toward a more nationalized politics environment. So, this is perhaps just a new era in redistricting and the goals of it. But we've also had the Voting Rights Act to be the more objective backbone of what districts need to look like. And that is going away piece by piece. So how do you all see the future of, is there an objective standard? Is it going to be in each state's statutes or constitutions, and how are we how can we have any kind of balance in that going forward?
We've had the Voting Rights Act since 1965, so it hasn't been that long in the first place, and it has been the best thing that we could imagine, and it's been incredibly powerful, and we've had lots and lots and lots of voting rights challenge since also. And we have 41 states that have no state voting rights. So if the court rules to eviscerate what's remaining of the Voting Rights Act, Supreme Court rules to eviscerate what's remaining of the Voting Rights Act nationally this term, which is what looks likely, and only California and a handful of other states have a Voting Rights Act at all, then it's a pretty dangerous time, actually. And you know, just to say it, when we got the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we got it because we witnessed, the country witnessed incredible violence, incredible discrimination that they could see on TV, that they understood was about an us versus them. Feels like we're in that time now. So I hope that we must muster the will to insist that we're for all of us and that we're for equality and that we move forward. But yeah, we got to get there, and we actually do need to get on that.
Any other questions? Nobody behind me? Well, maybe just before we wrap then, ask each of you, like, what are you going to be looking for in the next 6 or so weeks between now and November 4th? What are you curious about? What are you anticipating? What are you wondering about?
Well, sure. I am hoping for robust conversations like this. I'm hoping that people will come together to talk about what they want, what they believe in. Some people will be wrong, some people will be right. But we'll be having a conversation, because that's actually what works for democracy, and that we'll be thoughtful about it, and we'll be planning for an election that matters for us. So that's something that each of you can do, that each of us can do. We can walk precincts if we are so inclined. People need it. They need to be helped to understand what's at stake wherever you are on it. And we also need to be in active conversation in our communities for the matters.
And I would add to that. I think the most important messengers in our communities are folks that we trust. And so whether that be our neighbors or we talked about the big names, but I really do think that when we invest in local organizations, local communities, local people, that makes a huge difference, especially when we're talking about such a wonky thing. And so the more people that go out and have these dialogues and have these conversations and support each other in encouraging themselves to fill out the ballot or go to the polling location, I think that's really important. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I'm hoping turnout goes pretty well in this election. I think most of us are also looking toward 2026 and what's going to happen. That's ultimately what this ballot initiative is trying to move toward, with some change in the subsequent elections. But I'm hoping that there will be, without too much of this crazy kind of ad wars we're already seeing. You know, it won't all be about ad wars. If people are saying, well, this is good. Yeah. And I know we're going to compromise on some things, but maybe it's worth it. Or you say, well, I don't really want to do it this time, but I know where I'm going to vote in 2026. And that may lead to some of the similar outcomes you want to see anyway.
Eric, you can answer that question, but just on, in terms of turnout, do you look at more like the recall elections of Gray Davis and Gavin Newsom, or because it's an off-time election, like what is a special election? Like, how do you figure out what the turnout model is going to be?
Very careful. Ask Eric. I think that is the big challenge. I mean, having it be in an odd year and one issue, I think it's just very hard to predict. What you want to do is look for indicators of engagement. How much attention have you been paying to this? Knowledge? Do you have an opinion on it? How firm is your commitment? History of voting too. History of voting. And so, but I think that's really, the thing that we'll be watching arguably most closely is just who's getting more engaged over time, and who's not getting engaged.
Way back, when I first came to California, lower turnout elections tended to help Republicans, because Republicans were the most likely to vote. Is that not true anymore? 'Cause it
Nah.
seems like Democrats now are the party of the elite regular voters.
Things have flipped. The older voters were the most reliable voters,
Yeah.
and back in the sixties, seventies, they were Republicans.
Yeah.
It's no longer the case. So
All these boomers are.
the older voters are more Democratic in this.
And college education, I mean, the fact that
Education.
college educated voters are much more democratic.
So if you're a, yeah, if you wanted to pass, right, what kind of turnout are you?
You know, I think it's too oversimplified to just say you want less turnout, right? Because everybody wants because there are a lot at the same time. But it is the case that the old fear that if it's a low turnout election, that's bad news for the Democrats. That's not true. On the other hand, if I were advising the Democratic campaign, I would be saying, boy, look at those undecided numbers among Latinos, Asian Americans, Black voters, young voters. You need to get some of those folks engaged and out there to be more confident in.
All right, well, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks to our panel. Thanks for coming. Don't forget to vote.